Welcome to this week's Pascal's China Lens. And this week's the question is, should our kids, our children in Europe, in America, in the West, learn Chinese to prepare for a future where China is central to the world? Should our kids in Europe or America or Australia, any Western country, learn Chinese when they're young? I mean, if you think about it, China will be the biggest economic power in the world. And so it makes sense to learn the language of 1.4 billion people that are going to be the center of the economy of the future. It will give an advantage to kids that have studied Chinese when they're young so that they can actually deal with the new economy and the new world that is coming up. Well, this question has been asked to me many, many times by both parents as well as kids even that want to know, should I study? Now, I believe we shouldn't. And I'll explain why. Now, for my personal situation, my daughter, she's 19 years old now. She's lived 14 years in China. She's born in China. And so for her, learning Chinese, and she can read it and speak it quite well right now, it's kind of natural. That's normal because we were living in China and she was in a bilingual school. So that makes sense. It's a huge asset for her future. But for most kids, they don't have that environment. Now, my wife and I, we both studied 1 year in Beijing in the university, intense language course of Chinese. And for my wife, it's been very efficient because in 1 year time, she was able to get herself or made herself understood in the streets when she was buying things or whatever she did in China, people understood her Chinese. So it was in 1 year time, you can get to a really good level in China if you're there. For myself, it's quite a little bit different because I've been passionate about China since I was 12 years old. I mean, my room was full of posters of Bruce Lee and at that time even ninjas because I didn't know the difference between Japan and China, but I was passionate about the East. And so when I was 18 years old, I went to university, I studied Chinese sinology, and I had to study really, really hard every day to understand and learn the language. I mean, these were my dictionaries that I was using. I mean, imagine, this is thousands and thousands of words. If you don't know 2,000 characters, and they're unique characters that you have to remember, you can't even read a newspaper. You need about 3,000 to 4,000 to actually be understood generally by Chinese and have it at a quite mature level. So this is a huge investment. But the worst thing, after 4 years of study, I arrived in Beijing, and most of the people, they didn't understand a word of what I was saying. I thought they would all understand me. They didn't. So I had to really study hard another year in Beijing before my level was really advanced. And so is it worth the investment? And if you're not in China, I don't think you can actually reach any higher level at all. I mean, except for some geniuses around here. But I don't believe it's really worth the investment. And there's 3 reasons why I think we should not learn Chinese or let our kids learn Chinese. The first reason is that Chinese kids are learning English. Most of them in 10 years from now will all be able to speak very, very good English. And this is all because of online learning. It's about this AI that's being used to personalize this learning for learning English. And I've seen very, very young kids speak very, very good English. So why would we do it? The other reason is that from a business perspective, because that's the goal, to do it for the future. I know so many Western businessmen that are extremely successful in China and don't speak a word of Chinese. They know ni hao and zaijian, so hello and goodbye, and maybe some other terms, but that's about it. They are dependent on Chinese people around them. And that is exactly the point. It's a much better investment to invest in a few friends, Chinese friends, that can translate for you, help you, that really know what you want and reach your goals, than actually invest in the language, except if you're extremely passionate about the language and the culture. But just from a practical, pragmatic point of view, I don't think it's worth the investment. And finally, I would say that knowing that China is becoming the biggest economy in the world, knowing that this is becoming a real power block, a cultural power block, it's a civilization of 2,500 years, I think instead of learning their civilization, we should emphasize our civilization here in Europe or elsewhere. And so I think we should maybe consider learning languages like French and German and Spanish at a much earlier age if we want to basically capture the culture and capture the language. I mean, I studied Latin and Greek, and I don't see any difference with studying 6 years of Latin and Greek or 6 years of Chinese here in Europe. So it's the same thing. But in our context, I would rather have our kids study Latin and Greek than have them study Chinese, because I believe this is our culture that they will benefit from more than they will benefit from a Chinese culture. So I think there's no reason whatsoever to get our kids to learn Chinese. Maybe one last thing I would like to add. When I studied Chinese in university, I used this little dictionary. I use it every single day. I mean, this was my Bible of Chinese, and every word I had to look up. Now, I don't know if you can see it clearly, but these characters, I can tell you, they're so small that the result of it, after 2 years of study, I had to wear glasses. I'm not sure if it's just about me, but would you want to risk that to your children? I'm not sure. I think studying Chinese is intense. It's really a lot of investment. And on the other hand, it really doesn't help our culture. And maybe you even damage your eyes as a potential. So my advice is don't study Chinese as a kid. Study any language in Europe unless you're extremely passionate about China and what's happening in that culture, just like I am. So now you know why I believe our kids should not learn Chinese at a young age. Now, if you still believe I'm wrong and you believe it's very important for your kid, let me know and I might give you some tips how to do it faster. Hope to see you next week in another episode of Pascal's China Lens.